The Reformation in Sweden is generally regarded as having begun in 1527 during the reign of King Gustav I of Sweden, but the process was slow and did not end definitively until the Uppsala Synod of 1593 and the following war against Sigismund, with an attempted counter-reformation during the reign of John III. The Swedish Reformation meant the break with the Roman Catholic Church and the foundation of the Swedish Church. It is considered to be the ending point of the Swedish Middle Ages. The Reformation made Sweden a Protestant country and also included Finland, which formed an integral part of Sweden at the time. Now, as mentioned earlier, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Sweden, Gustav Trolle's conflict with Regent Sten Sture the Younger and Sweden's parliament, the Riksdag, forced him to flee to Denmark in 1521 during the Swedish War of Liberation, where Gustav Vasa came to power in Sweden with the excommunicated parliament and introduced Protestantism in Sweden. But the Pope did not give up either. Trolle's successor as Archbishop Johannes Magnus was not in Sweden. Sweden was controlled politically and militarily in practice entirely by the excommunicated parliament, with Gustav Vasa at the helm. As the interdict applied in principle to the entirety of Sweden, the Roman Catholic Church formally went on strike, refusing to authorize the regime in both states. From the perspective of the parliament and Gustav Vasa, there was a concrete need to solve the problem of a striking church against the state. Lutheranism offered an alternative, a functioning church under state control. The situation in Denmark was at large the same, and the same needs initiated the Reformation in Denmark, Norway, and Holstein as it did in Sweden. In 1523, King Gustav I of Sweden met the reformer Laurentius Andreae and was influenced by Protestantism. In the following year, the king officially broke contacts with Rome. Laurentius Andreae introduced the king to the reformed priest Olaus Petri, who was made preacher in the Storkyrkan in Stockholm. In 1525, the royal priest Olaus Petri married, effectively demonstrating the king's consent to the abolition of the celibacy of the priesthood, and providing a breach with the Roman Catholic Church's ban of marriage of priests. In 1526, the New Testament was published in Swedish. In the winter of 1526, the king offered to arrange a colloquy between Olaus Petri and Roman Catholic professor Peter Galle. But Galle refused, stating church matters were not open to discussion. At the Riksdag of Västerås in 1527, known as the Reformation Riksdag, the estates agreed to a number of demands towards Reformation, such as to give the king mandate to confiscate clerical assets, that all churches were henceforth to be illegal without royal consent, in effect placing the church under royal control, and that the clergy were to be subject to secular law, and finally that only the words of the Bible were to be taught in sermons in churches and schools. At the Riksdag of Västerås was followed by the reduction of Gustav I of Sweden, in which the economic demand of the monarch was met. The assets of the Roman Catholic Church were confiscated, eradicating church economic independence from the crown, thus making the clergy economically dependent on the crown. In parallel with a ban from accepting new novices and a ban for the convents to prevent their existing members from leaving, this act indirectly resulted in the suppression of the monasteries, which lost their economic foundations. The economic reform was followed by the fulfilling of the theological demands through the Orebro Synod of 1529, in which Roman Catholic rituals such as the veneration of saints and pilgrimages were discouraged and described as no longer part of a religious practice by the Church, and the sermons of priests and monks were subjected to control of the crown to ensure that they were founded only on the words of the Bible, and a process toward reform in religious practice was thereby initiated. The same year, a handbook in Swedish was published describing the correct way of performing baptism, weddings, funerals, and other religious rituals. In 1530, the king opened a rift with Rome when he appointed Laurentius Petri as Archbishop of Uppsala without the Pope's consent or confirmation. The religious tensions resulted in the unsuccessful Westrogothian rebellion of the nobility and Dalecarlian rebellions of the peasantry during the 1520s and 1530s, the latter attempting to depose the king in favor of the purported son of Christina Gillestierna. Until 1536, the Swedish Reformation was in essence characterized as Reformed Roman Catholicism. The final break between Sweden and Rome occurred with the abolition of the canon law in Sweden in 1536, followed by the Synod of Uppsala. The entire Swedish Church was now declared independent from Rome. Between 1539 and 1543, the king was influenced by Conrad von Pihe, and the Swedish Reformation was performed under a German pattern. In 1541, the Bible was translated to Swedish, and in 1543, the New Testament was translated to Finnish, which is considered a great contribution to the development of each language. During the 1540s, the religious tensions resulted in the Peasant Daca War, which also failed to defeat the monarchy. During the succession parliament in Västerås of 1544, radical theological reforms were introduced. These states agreed to a number of Reformation principles and altered some aspects of ritual practice, including the elimination of holy water, incense, and the adoration of saints. They also eliminated requiem masses and many holy days. Consolidation of the Reformation continued until Eric XIV of Sweden, who came to the throne in 1560 and at first imposed not rigid doctrinal uniformity, but rather uniform recognition of his authority over the Church, while admitting substantial numbers of French Huguenot Calvinists to his kingdom. The Swedish Church, however, refused Calvinism in the Synod of Stockholm in 1565. Now, the reign of John III of Sweden in 1568 up until 1592 signified certain leanings toward a counter-reformation in Sweden, inspired by the king's Roman Catholic wife, Queen Catherine Jagiellon, who acted as a mediator in the king's negotiations with the Pope in Rome for the conditions in which Sweden would be willing to return to Roman Catholicism. John III leaned towards Reformed Catholicism and suggested to Rome that Sweden, in the event of a counter-reformation, should be allowed to keep marriage for the clergy, use Swedish German Church, and have a theology based upon the Church Fathers instead of the doctrines of the Council of Trent. In parallel, the Swedish Church introduced the Swedish Church Ordinance of 1571, establishing a Swedish Church doctrine. The new Protestant Church Ordinance, however, was given Roman Catholic-inclined additions by the king, such as the Nova Ordinantia of 1575 and his own church doctrine, the Red Book of 1576, two additions which introduced a middle stance between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, and introduced many Roman Catholic customs. The king's additions to the church ordinance were not followed in all of Sweden, particularly not in the duchy belonging to his Calvinist brother Charles, and there was opposition toward it among the clergy. These conflicting doctrines resulted in the long-going liturgical struggle between the Roman Catholic and Protestant sympathizers, and a split between the king and the church. John III and his queen also performed several other controversial Roman Catholic-leaning acts, which demonstrated their intention. In 1575, the king returned the unrestricted right to receive novices to Vadstena Abbey, which was reformed in accordance with the Council of Trent by the Jesuit papal legate Antonio Posevino, during which its abbess Caterina Gilta swore the Tridentine Oath, and the first Roman Catholic solemn mass since the Reformation was held in the abbey. In the capital, a Roman Catholic seminary, Collegium Regium Stockholmense, was established by Laurentius Nicolai. The counter-reformatory efforts contributed to tension in connection to the imprisoned Eric XIV, who came to be a symbol of Protestantism in prison. During his imprisonment, three major conspiracies were made to depose John III. The negotiations between the royal couple and Rome were ultimately not successful. Rome was not willing to accept the Reformed Catholicism in exchange for Counter-Reformation, and the Counter-Reformation in Sweden diminished after the death of Queen Catherine and the king's remarriage to the Protestant Gunilla Bjelke. The personal union with Roman Catholic Poland under the Roman Catholic Sigismund III Vasa in 1592 to 1598 resulted in a final clash between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism in Sweden. The tensions finally resulted in the Uppsala Synod of 1593, where Protestantism, in accordance with the Augsburg Confession, was adopted as the state religion. Roman Catholicism was to be abandoned, the Swedish Church was to return to the doctrines of the Swedish Church Ordinance of 1571, and the Nova Ordinantia of 1575 and the Red Book of 1576 was to be removed from it. The suppression of the monasteries was finally completed with the closure of Vadstena Abbey in 1595. The Protestants united under the king's Protestant uncle Duke Charles against the Roman Catholic Sigismund, and thereby the Polish-Swedish Union and Roman Catholicism, which resulted in the war against Sigismund of 1598. The war ended with Sigismund's defeat, and thereby Roman Catholicism in Sweden, and the execution of his followers in the Linköping bloodbath in 1600, putting any attempts to restore Sweden to Roman Catholicism at a definitive end.